From the University at Buffalo School of Social Work, welcome to the In Social Work podcast. I'm Peter Sabota. It's good to have you along, everybody. A quick personal note, I'll be retiring from our faculty and ending my role with the podcast after 18 years of podcasts. At the end, I'll make a brief so long if you would like to hear it. I'll miss you and the podcast. Today, we're examining a topic that sits at the intersection of democracy, civil rights, public policy, and the social work profession itself. That's the recent Supreme Court decisions that many legal scholars and civil rights advocates argue have significantly weakened the Voting Rights Act of 1965. All brought to a recent head by the court's April 2026 ruling in Louisiana versus Calais. The court's 6-3 decision invalidated Louisiana's congressional map containing a second majority black district, and even more consequentially, substantially narrowed how federal voting rights protections apply to redistricting disputes. One rationale that was given was essentially that racism is not as bad as it's been in the past. For many Americans, voting rights may seem primarily like a legal or political issue. But for social workers, questions of representation, civil participation, access to power, and equitable public policy are deeply connected to the profession's core values and ethics. Who has political voice and who does not shapes decisions about housing, schools, healthcare, mental health services, child welfare systems, disability services, environmental justice, public safety, and economic opportunity. Our guest today, Sunny Harris-Rome, MSW-JD, is uniquely qualified to lay out the legal implications inherent here and also provide a social work perspective and the likely impacts on our broader society. Sunny Harris-Rome is Professor Emerita of Social Work at the George Mason University. And a quick postscript. On the day we recorded our interview with Sunny Rome, Alabama submitted changes to their congressional map to the Supreme Court. And on June 2nd, about a week later, the Supreme Court ruled in their favor. Hi, Sunny, and welcome to In Social Work.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming out of a life of so-called leisure to do our podcast. We really appreciate it. Let me just kind of frame things a little bit to begin here. We know that not everyone out there, including social workers, are following election laws really closely. But today, I think what we probably both want to argue is that we can't afford not to at this point. So in late April of 26, we're recording, by the way, on the 29th of May. The U.S. Supreme Court issued a decision in Louisiana versus, is it Calais or
Calais.
Calais, okay. And almost immediately, a landmark decision about congressional redistricting, racial gerrymandering, and the scope of Section 2, which we'll get into, of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The court made a 6-3 decision, shockingly along party lines, and invalidated Louisiana's congressional map that contained a second majority black district and substantially narrowed how federal voting rights protections apply in redistricting disputes. So we want to find out what's different now. In short, I think what the court just did is that they ruled that Louisiana's second majority black congressional district was an unconstitutional racial gerrymander. I'm trying to say this with a straight face, and held that complying with Section 2 did not justify the state's race-conscious districting in that case. So I guess racism isn't that bad. So, Sunny, we're turning to you to help us learn and think about what's going on and how this is going to affect the populations that social workers serve, and what responsibilities do we have in our response? So we hope that you're up to this dilemma.
Well, we'll see.
Yes,
Um,
for people who can't see Sunny, she is laughing, but I think good-heartedly. Did you want to say something, Sunny?
just that before we actually zero in on the case and on section 2,
Sure.
I just wanted to give a little background about the Voting Rights Act to kind of position us for
Yeah.
discussion of the
So the
specifics.
big picture. Go. Yeah, go. Please go right ahead. Jump right in.
So I'm going to take us all the way back to the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which was passed in 1870, which enshrined the right to vote for African Americans. Okay. What happened subsequently, particularly in the southern states, is that because they couldn't now outright prohibit voting by African Americans, they found all kinds of workarounds to make it virtually impossible for African Americans to register and to vote. So they enacted things like poll taxes, right? Charging exorbitant fees in order for people to vote, African American people specifically. Um, uh, they implemented literacy tests. And I don't know, Peter, if you've seen any of these, I suggest your readers look online because you can find examples of them. And whether or not one passed was at the discretion of the white administrator. Um, so, there was nothing objective about the administration of these tests. I actually found one online that I gave to my graduate students, and they were unable to pass it in the amount of time that was given.
Wow.
So, yeah,
Okay. Yeah.
pretty amazing. And,
Mm.
just outright intimidation, violence that kept African Americans from registering and from voting. Um, Fast forward quite a bit to the civil rights movement of the 1960s, right? Whose actual primary agenda was to register African Americans in the South to vote.
Right.
And some of the listeners might, be familiar with Freedom Summer,
Mm.
when, more than 1,000 young people from the North were bused down to the South, largely to Mississippi, where the problem was worst, to register African Americans to vote. It turned out to be a very dangerous proposition. There was a very high profile murder of 3 of the volunteers. This was followed by really the immediate catalyst for the Voting Rights Act, which was what we call Bloody Sunday, the march over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, right, from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, which was met with horrific violence, injury, and death to many of the participants. And what was noteworthy was that this was an era when having televisions was becoming popular. And so, unlike in previous eras, all of these confrontations and violence were televised across the country, which built enormous empathy, which built outrage. There was a lot of pressure, which drove then President Johnson to do something. And the something that he did was the Voting Rights Act. And the Voting Rights Act goes further than the 15th Amendment in making sure, guaranteeing that African Americans, other racial minorities, people of minority language communities, all have an equal chance to vote, an equal chance to be represented in government. So it was a fairly sweeping law that included a lot of practical measures to make sure that those guarantees would be realized. So
Yeah. And
that's sort of how we got to
yeah.
the Voting Rights Amendment. And I just want to add that it was always historically, um, it was reauthorized numerous times over the years, always by sweeping majorities in both
Mhm.
houses of Congress. But things in more recent years have taken a very different turn.
Yes, and actually, and some of that historical background, it's my understanding that the law was actually strengthened and revised to kind of, give people a chance um, to challenge and to protect the rights that were inherent in the original act. But I think we're going to get to that. I'm going to ask you at some point to opine on whether or not you think it's successful or not. But in what is in the news today here in late May is this decision by the Supreme Court that didn't, it didn't eliminate Section 2, but it really kind of narrowed it. So let's get folks a little more narrowly oriented to what you just said here. Can you tell us what is Section 2 of the VRA, and what was it really, trying to accomplish in the Voting
So,
Rights Act?
Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, the VRA, is often thought of as kind of the heart of the Voting Rights Act. And it does a couple of things, right? It prohibits denying or abridging the right to vote um, on the basis of race, color, or membership in a language minority group. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it also guarantees that members, every member of one of those groups, um, has an equal opportunity, equal to all others, both to vote and to elect representatives of their choosing, which is very relevant to the case that we're going to talk about now.
Yeah.
So you can see how much further it goes than just
Mm-hmm.
saying African Americans have the right to vote, right? Um,
Exactly.
yeah.
And and part of what I think they've done is they've really narrowed how the challenges get enacted. Is that fair to say that you used to be able to say if you were making a challenge, you could demonstrate results. You could show how people were affected and say this is unjust. Is it fair to say now that they've switched that from kind of, I don't know how to talk about it other than results,
Mhm.
but now you have to prove discrimination, and that smells like it's really hard to do.
Well, you're absolutely right.
Okay.
Um,
Whew.
and it's not just proving discrimination. I'll just be a little more precise.
Yeah,
It's
good.
proving intentional race discrimination. In other words,
Yeah.
um, I'm going to back up if that's okay.
Yeah.
All
Yeah,
right, and
please.
just kind of lay some groundwork about gerrymandering and redistricting so that all of this makes sense.
Perfect.
Okay. All right. So
Hmm.
this is a redistricting case.
Hmm.
Um, Redistricting, as I'm sure everybody knows, right, that for purposes of electing who represents us, both in Congress and in our state legislatures, the state map is divided into districts and you vote for the candidates in your district. Okay. Every 10 years after the census, these maps are redrawn, right? The boundaries of where these districts are in order to
I,
reflect
I,
population.
I'm sorry for interrupting, but I had to comment on the after the census comment. Though that's really old school, Sonny. That's nice. Okay.
That's right. Well, that's the way it traditionally has been done
Yeah.
to
Mhm.
reflect shifts in population. Okay, that whole thing has now been turned on its head.
Mhm.
Um, and each state has its own method of who gets to make these decisions, right? In some states, there's either a nonpartisan commission or a bipartisan commission. In some states, the legislatures draw the maps. In some states, political appointees draw the maps. It's different in every state. And the reason you were laughing, of course, for our listeners' benefit, is that President Trump has urged red states to redraw their maps before the next census, which is permissible. It just had not been routinely done. And now we've got this huge contest going on with more and more states redrawing their maps. Texas redrew its map. California, to counter, redrew its map, right, to sort of balance the scales, try to balance the scales on how many Republican versus Democratic representatives were added. And now many states are in the mix. I live in Virginia, which has had quite the battle royale over
Yes.
redrawing its map. So yeah, now, that does feel old school to just have this happen after the census.
And by the way, just to pile on here, I just read today's Friday. On Wednesday, I read in the paper that Alabama has jumped in, that they lost a federal case and they're going to the Supreme Court. Yeah, and they're going to use this decision
Yep.
to probably prevail, would be my hunch. But sorry, I interrupted.
No,
Go.
that's quite all right. So, okay, so gerrymandering. So, gerrymandering is when you deliberately manipulate the redistricting process to either magnify or dilute political power,
Mhm.
right? To make some group more powerful or make some group less powerful. And it actually is thought, I thought this was interesting, thought to go back as far as 1789. So this is
Mhm.
nothing new.
Right.
When Patrick Henry drew district lines to favor James Monroe over James Madison.
Mm.
And the term gerrymander was coined in 1812 when the governor of Massachusetts, whose name was Elbridge Gerry or Jerry, approved a map that advantaged Republicans. And one district was so oddly shaped in order to do that, that a political cartoonist thought that district resembled a salamander. So the term gerrymander is a mashup between the governor's name, Jerry, and a salamander, gerrymander.
I didn't know that. See,
Yeah.
this is good. Yeah.
So suffice it to say that gerrymandering has become another way of not prohibiting racial minorities from voting, but diluting the impact of their votes. Okay? Because
Mhm.
to elect a representative of their choice, they would need to be in the majority in a district. And
Mhm.
so this, where we draw the lines, influences population centers. Okay.
Mhm.
When we talk about diluting political power through gerrymandering, states use two strategies, and the courts use these terms a lot, so I just wanted to mention them. One is packing,
Mhm.
which means drawing districts to contain as large a concentration as possible of a particular group. So let's say you wanted to dilute the voting power of African Americans, you would try to corral them all within one or a limited number of districts
Mhm.
so that they might prevail in those districts, but you could pretty much guarantee that they'd be a minority in all the other districts, and
Mhm.
therefore other candidates, right, would prevail. And the other is kind of its inversing, which is called cracking, which
Oh.
is when you draw districts so that, let's say, African Americans, as our example, are spread out as much as possible so that, again, there's no district in which they can prevail because they're in the majority. Okay,
Yes.
so we either concentrate them or we spread them out. But the goal in either case is to dilute the power of their vote by keeping them in the minority within a district. Okay,
Mhm.
so um, those are kind of the two ways that this is done.
Yeah.
Okay. So the Calais decision, as
Yeah.
you mentioned, just a month right ago. Um, Overall, you were absolutely right that it greatly curtails the opportunity to prove a violation of the Voting Rights Act or to get an appropriate remedy if you do prove that there's been a violation.
Mm.
Um, this is kind of an odd case, and the legal reasoning is kind of complicated. So I don't want to
Hmm.
get too much in the weeds. I'll
Yeah.
just try to make it as clear as I can, and you'll let me know, I'm sure, if this is not making any sense.
No, no, and I want you to do that because, again, I'm not the expert here, but my limited understanding of this is that this decision, I think, can be looked at two ways. What's it going to do legally? And then what does it mean for its impact on people? And so,
Absolutely.
yeah, so feel free to frame this however you'd like to help us
Okay, so
understand that.
we'll start with the legal, right?
Sure.
Kind of get that out of the way. Okay, so what happened here was that back in 2022, the state of Louisiana redrew its congressional map, and a federal judge ruled that the map likely violated the Voting Rights Act because it needed a second majority Black district, right? That this was, um, that the Black vote was too diluted, that it based on its population and its African American population, it really needed to have another majority Black district. So it sent Louisiana back to the drawing board.
Hmm.
Louisiana redrew its map to comply with the Voting Rights Act. It was challenged, the one with the second majority Black district.
Yep.
And that challenge took it all the way up to eventually to the Supreme Court, to the case that was decided just recently. Um, and the court threw out the new map, the Supreme Court, saying that, as you indicated, that the Voting Rights Act, in fact, didn't require a second majority Black district. And in drawing one, Louisiana had violated the Equal Protection Act of the Constitution. Okay, so the Equal Protection Act,
Yeah, say a tiny bit more about that, please.
the Equal Protection Act um, prohibits basically race discrimination on the basis of a number of things, one of which is race. Basically saying that only under really exceptional circumstances is it permissible to treat people differently based on their race? Okay.
Hmm.
So if you think about it, you're not permitted to treat people differently on the basis of race. And it was passed during Reconstruction. So
Hmm.
we know that its purpose was really to enfranchise newly freed slaves, right? So that was the idea at the time. Things have morphed since then,
Hmm.
but that was the idea. But the whole Voting Rights Act is premised on race, right? So the Voting Rights Act had always been viewed as an exception to this prohibition on doing things based on race. Not so after this case.
So that's, and a lot of people who I've talked with since this, they just said, okay, what happened? But that's it right there. That's what happened. Um,
That's what
and
happened. One of the things that happened.
and of course, this has nothing to do, I'm sure, with the fact that African Americans tend to vote overwhelmingly for Democratic candidates. So that has nothing to do with this, of course,
Well,
right?
we're going to get to that too, because that's
Okay.
implicated in this case too.
Oh, okay. All right. I'll
Okay,
take that.
so that's one thing. So under the Calais decision, right,
Hmm.
the court rewrote the criteria for finding a violation of the Voting Rights Act. And this goes to something that you said earlier, which is that now under Calais, you have to prove not just that a map abridges the voting rights of racial or language minorities, but that it does so intentionally. And if you stop and think about that, it's really something, because intentionality, right, motive, is virtually impossible to prove. It's something that goes on in people's minds, right? Why you're doing this.
Yeah.
It's rarely explicitly stated. Usually what we see is what you said, the effects of it, the impact of it. That is no longer enough for a violation of the Voting Rights Act. Now, you have to show, in the case of gerrymandering, that the districts were drawn for the purpose of disenfranchising a racial minority. Okay.
Yeah.
And now I'm going to tie in what you said a minute ago.
Okay.
It's made even more difficult by the fact that while racial gerrymandering is prohibited, partisan gerrymandering is perfectly legal. And by that I mean
since 17 something, yeah.
Which is, in the case of gerrymandering, drawing district lines to advantage a particular political party. That's okay. Racial gerrymandering isn't. And as you said, in this country, there's a huge overlap between race and political party affiliation. So, and I'll just give you an example, right? So in 2016 and 2020, in the two presidential races, in 2016, 89% of African Americans. In 2020, 87% of African Americans voted for the Democratic candidate. Right? It's huge. So under this case, Calais, to make a successful case that an electoral map violates the Voting Rights Act, you'd have to be able to disentangle race from partisanship and prove that it was race and not partisanship that was the motivating factor.
Well, easy peasy.
Yeah. So, this is virtually impossible. So this is basically what legally the story is with Calais. I just want to mention two other trends that are kind of behind this. The first is that I mentioned that the Equal Protection Clause originally was designed to provide newly freed slaves, right, with their rightful place in American society, give them all the rights of their white counterparts. Okay. Over the past 45 years or so, the Supreme Court has reinterpreted the Equal Protection Clause to say that it's not about protecting against discrimination just against groups that have historically been disadvantaged, but discrimination is discrimination, and it's wrong no matter what. So discriminating against whites is treated legally identically with discriminating against people of color. That sort of reverse discrimination idea that we've seen.
Yes.
And you can see this in the Calais decision, where the court struck down a majority Black district as being race discrimination, right? That wouldn't have happened if we were still interpreting the Equal Protection Clause the way it was originally intended. Yeah. So the other thread running through this is that we've been hearing for quite some time from the Supreme Court. There's been this drumbeat that we don't need these laws that protect historically disadvantaged populations because we're beyond racism.
We're
Things have
enlightened.
gotten
Yep.
so much better that we can now dispense with all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And you see that running through this case and others as well. So who needs the Voting Rights Act, as you said,
Yeah.
right? There's no more discrimination.
I'll hesitate for a heavy pause there, but I don't want to shift gears too much on you, but I guess I'm going to a little bit. We've been talking about the Voting Rights Act, 60 plus years in place. Um, and then specifically Section 2. Choose whichever one or both. At least in your opinion, I think I know the answer to this, but did it have an impact? Was the impact positive?
It had a huge impact. And, almost immediately, which is really quite something.
Mm-hmm.
Just after the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, by the end of 1965, 250,000 new Black voters had been registered, right? I mean, it's really astounding. Just because of this new law put in place. And the number of elected Black public officials, right, the people we vote for, also who represent us. In 1970, there were about 1,500. Now there are about 10,000.
That's an impact.
Right? At all levels of government. It's undeniable that it has had an impact. And in another case, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and I'm going to probably massacre her quote, but another important case that started this sort of trend to eviscerate the Voting Rights Act because it was no longer necessary. She made an analogy to it's like throwing out your umbrella in the middle of a rainstorm because all this time it was protecting you from getting wet. So if things have improved, it's because of laws like the Voting Rights Act. So jettisoning all of this is going to have huge consequences.
Yeah. So and let's yeah, this is what's great about having you is because you bring both perspectives in terms of law and social work. So if we could pivot a little bit more to social work and get social work into the mix here. Um, and from a social work perspective, in addition to being an attorney, you're a scholar who has framed, and I want to be clear here, you have framed civic participation as foundational to social work, and that this is something that we should be on all of the time. Um, and you've authored a book titled Voting is Social Work. So I think we kind of know where you stand, but let me drill down on both of those if I could here. So the first one is, and I think people misunderstand this, why should political participation matter to social workers and how they position, for example, their practice and who they serve? Why do you think that's such a big deal?
Um, well, for a number of reasons. Uh, Voting, which is part of political participation, right? In terms of our own participation, I'll start with that as social workers. It's probably the easiest way for us as social workers to have a say in how our government operates, which affects, as we know, everything from the regulations that govern our practice,
Mm-hmm.
right? To the needs of our clients, um, their life chances, the problems that they face, as well as the resources that are available to us
Yeah.
to help them, right? All of that is framed by government. And so political participation is the most kind of elemental way that we can influence that.
Yeah. And just being kind of inspired by what you just said, I'm also thinking that if you want to fight healthcare disparities, this is probably the playing field. Um, yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. Okay, so I
Um,
didn't mean to interrupt, but
no,
you
no.
you have me thinking here.
Um, in terms of the clients whom we serve,
Hmm.
right, these are the same people by and large who are going to be affected by what's happening with the Voting Rights Act.
Hmm.
Um, we're talking about further marginalizing people who have already been marginalized.
Yeah,
Um, I think the reason I focus on voting is that it's supposed to be the great equalizer in our society,
yeah.
right? No matter rich, poor, gay, straight, male, female,
Hmm.
whatever,
Hmm.
um, everybody gets the same one vote. And taking away that vote is like taking away a recognition of our personhood, of our value, right? Of
Hmm.
our basic humanity.
Hmm.
So it's really, threatening voting rights, I see as really drastic in terms of its effect on individuals, as well as, the likely disenfranchisement of entire communities.
So this kind of begs the question, and I'll just ask you, um, why are we in the streets?
Why are we or why aren't we?
Aren't. We are not, to my own assessment, certainly not like the mid 60s.
Well, I think, if the we is the sort of broader we,
The broader
the
the
broader
broader
we,
society, yeah.
I think we're seeing a lot of that pushback. Um, a lot of people have been turning out for No King's Day around the
Mm-hmm.
country. People are standing on overpasses and street corners with signs, right? There are people who've been organizing against ICE's presence in their communities and doing
Yep.
amazing things neighbor to neighbor in
Mm-hmm.
terms of walking children to school if families are afraid to be out on the street, right,
Mm-hmm.
with an ICE presence there. Um, Making sure that people get groceries. There's a lot, I think, that
Yeah.
has been going on.
Yeah.
Um,
That's fair.
and I think showing up at those things is really critical. I
Yeah.
don't think in and of themselves they're going to change anything, but I think keeping up that drumbeat that
Mm-hmm.
there's resistance, being seen in opposition to things that are going on is really important.
Yeah. And we'll get to that in a little bit when we try to get more practical. But just to keep on the theme that you were on in terms of why should this matter, and including to people like social workers who are in direct practice, who provide therapeutic counseling services. I want to bring it back to social work. Let's Peter, stop asking why people aren't in the streets. Let's talk about what's social work going to do. Um, so the NASW Code of Ethics, where our values are operationalized and put into action, those things place a strong emphasis on social justice and the dignity and worth of all
Mhm.
persons, right?
That's
So, from your point of view, and you've alluded to this, but I want to connect this directly to our ethics and values. How do voting rights connect to those values? And
so
how are they threatened by the decision? So, two questions there. How are
okay.
first are
Well,
they connected?
they're
Yeah,
related. Okay,
yeah.
so um, we can't have social justice, right, when we are further marginalizing people who are already marginalized in our society, which is what this decision and these attacks on the Voting Rights Act do. Um, that it's the populations who are already vulnerable who are taking the hit, and
Mhm.
that's not social justice, and we can't allow that to happen. Both on the big picture and because these are our client groups, right? In terms of the dignity and worth of the person, same thing. If you are stripped of representation in your country, you can't elect the represent people who represent you, right? Um, then your worth is not being recognized. It's like another form of erasure,
Mhm.
right? Um,
Mhm.
in terms of other aspects of the code of ethics, other social work values, um, voting and having a say in who represents you is also a form of self-determination.
Mhm.
It gives you some measure of control over your destiny, another
Mhm.
social work value.
Yep.
Take that away, right? And our self-determination
Mhm.
takes a hit.
And
Um, and, in,
empowerment, and if you want to think
and
about it that way
empowerment,
as well, yeah.
yeah. It's, there's a lot of research now on the benefits of voting. And in fact, there's evidence that it does increase self-esteem. It increases um, feelings of satisfaction. It improves health and mental health, builds stronger communities. All of those things are true. And discrimination, on the other hand, as you said, takes its toll. It's exhausting. Um, it's traumatic. It's disempowering.
Mhm.
So our clients, right? All of this violates our code of ethics, and we should be in the streets um, because of the impact that it has on client well-being. And as you also said, on the practical side, right? That if you're able to elect people who understand your background, your priorities, then the likelihood increases that they will respond to your community's needs, whether
Mhm.
it's health and mental health care, whether it's affordable housing, whether it's fair wages, whether it's support for minority owned businesses, whatever it is your community needs. And we've just seen that undermined.
Yeah. So, this reminds me of, whenever there are, I'm thinking about after George Floyd was murdered and the folks in Minnesota, in their, I think, shock and anger started burning, their downtown. And people were aghast, like, why would they do this? Why would they burn this all down? And in their own community, when it's clear, you don't have to look very far. It's actually pretty. I'm not advocating burning it down, but understanding why they burned it down, because they don't own any of it. They don't have any power in any of it. And I think that's also a consequence of these kinds of moves, societal, that just, like you said, beat people who are already disadvantaged further down, and then we blame them for reacting, which is perpetuates the whole game that's being played here.
And I think we have to look at what's happening with the um, near elimination of the Voting Rights Act. I think it's that
Yeah, death
cataclysmic.
by a thousand cuts. Yep.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
I think we have to keep in mind that that's part of a much larger agenda,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
in a couple of ways. You know, it's a one more piece in the sort of attack on DEI, which we've
Mm-hmm.
seen, right?
Mm-hmm.
Changing our history, book banning, erasure, and various of our history. Um, and it's also one piece in a much larger attack on free and fair elections. And there are all kinds of other things going on to undermine our elections and the participation of vulnerable groups in our electoral system. And this
Yeah.
is just one piece.
Yeah. And I think we should all understand that this is deliberate, intentional, patient, and so far fairly successful. So before I get too cynical, as is routine in our podcast, we try to discuss an issue at hand that we care about. And then, as always, it's kind of time to ask, okay, so what can be done? What can we do? What can social workers do to respond? Do you have any? Um,
So, you know, I think the thing to do really is to try to keep up with what's happening because things are changing fast. And honestly, that's part of the strategy too. That's part of the agenda, right? We're being hit from
Disinformation.
all sides, makes it
Mhm.
hard to respond. We're all feeling very, I think, stressed and overwhelmed. Um, I think in terms of voting rights, you know, we're having obstacles thrown in our way, and we need to change who's in the leadership of this country in terms of we have congressional elections coming up in November that are going to
Mhm.
be absolutely critical
Mhm.
because, in fact, some of these changes can be overridden by the legislature, right? When
Yes.
the court
Yes.
interprets something, Congress can come back and clarify what it actually intends in a
Hmm.
law. And so, you know, we need changes there. And I think we have obstacles, and we just have to work that much harder
Hmm.
to get out the vote, to make sure that
Mobilize. Yep.
people of color are voting, that other groups that are often sort of face obstacles getting to the polls um,
Hmm.
turn out. You know, we just have to redouble our efforts. And, you know, if you look at it looks like this latest decision is going to significantly reduce the number of African Americans in Congress.
Yep.
A third of the Congressional Black Caucus is likely to disappear, right? This
Hmm.
is, you know, hundreds of people at the state level, elected officials. It could be the biggest reduction in Black representation that we've ever seen. Um, and the response was from the African American leadership on the Hill was, okay, so they're throwing these obstacles in our way. We're just going to have to get past them. And I
Yeah.
think that's the attitude that we have to take as well.
Hmm. Yeah. And I would argue, I'd be interested in your take on this, is that I have been working in a school of social work like you for a long time, and and I'm not being judgmental here, but many students come in wanting, to focus on clinical work and providing interventions, and I get that there is a time and a place for all of that. But this kind of micro or macro dichotomy, I don't think helps us. I think it's both, right? I hope you were going to say right to that. It really should be both. And I'm really hoping that this is an invitation for us to get more invested and active in things like you were, I think, saying grassroots organizations, voter mobilization, going into communities and not saving them, but building coalitions inside of them. Because in trying to keep up with you reasonably for this podcast, I did some research on Section 2 challenges. And what I found that was surprising, because we've been talking about Congress in this conversation, what I found, and tell me if this is accurate, I found that many of the challenges are at the local level, like school boards and state and local legislatures. Is that accurate?
Yes, and in
Yeah.
fact, this recent case and the ones that preceded it are going
Hmm.
to go all the way down the chain and
Yep.
affect all of that.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly. Interesting.
I just wanted to add, I
Please.
totally
Yeah.
agree with you. Been beating this drum for many years about the dichotomy
Yes.
between
You're the
micro and
choir.
macro.
Hmm.
Um, but I just wanted to emphasize that there are some really easy things that you can do if this, sort of is outside your comfort zone, um, which is true of many people in our profession. And, the last few years, I've become the postcard party queen in my neighborhood. And it's great. I invite my friends over. I get, postcards. They tell you what to write on them, who to address them to, and we bring food and drink and sit around
Hmm.
and send off postcards, making sure that people remember there's an election and know to vote.
Hmm.
There are a lot of things you can do. Reminders on social media to your friends, your family, right? That there's an election coming up and making sure people have a plan for when and how they're going to vote. Um, it doesn't have to be doesn't have to be um, something that takes up all of your time, something that you're afraid of, right? You can send texts. There are people who organize that. You don't
Hmm.
have to talk to people face to face if that makes you uncomfortable. I mean, there are lots and lots of ways to help out, and I encourage that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you get a bunch of people doing that, it can have a big effect. So, you know, we have a few more minutes before we kind of have to cut ourselves off here, but I'm curious if you have given some thought as, a long-term and now, emeritus educator. Do you have any thoughts about how social work education might have to adapt to prepare students for in this current moment and kind of what's ahead? I'm thinking about, I know our curriculum best. I'm trying to think of how much we talk about civic engagement and participation. Of course, not all, don't get me wrong, not all, you know, people feel like they have to endure the policy class rather than, enjoy it like crazy. Um, and even democracy. I'm not, we get it here and there, but I just wonder if we would be wise to focus more on those macro level and crucial environmental issues.
So um, I would be a fan of more integration
Yeah,
between the micro and macro. So it's not just about requiring more policy classes.
right.
Um, or, I was privileged to be able to teach an elective on voting that had a lot of, community activity involved. But those are segmented off. And it's easy to kind of check the box if you're a student and say, okay, I took that class. I'm done with the macro stuff, right?
Yep.
I think the only way that it really makes sense is to integrate it so that if you're working with a particular population or interested in a particular population, you're seeing at the same time and learning about at the same time um, what the environmental forces, including laws and policies, that are in play at the same time that you're talking about how to intervene clinically with that population, so that you can really see clearly what person and environment means. We talk about it a lot.
Yes,
And it
we do.
distinguishes us as a profession from other mental health professions. But then we have curricula that kind of silo micro and macro.
Exactly.
So I'd like to see more integration.
Me too. And my hopeful space is that I have to say, to be fair, we have more and more students coming in recently who are kind of like hell bent from the get-go on macro practice. And so I really have seen a shift in that. I hope that that continues. So we are unfortunately, oh man, there's like 3 podcasts here. Um, I want to give you, I guess, the last word if you want to take it. But if I could, I'm also wondering how somebody such as yourself, who has been banging this drum for many years, um, how do you, where do you find the hope for change? And
I think
also, whatever last word you want to have, it's all yours, Sunny.
I think, it's very easy, as I said right now, for all of us to feel disillusioned and stressed over what's going on. And I was with a bunch of friends not long ago, and we were all, bemoaning the state of the world and particularly our country right now. And being overwhelmed can lead a lot of us to paralysis, which I think is a big danger. I think we can take a breath. My husband doesn't let me look at the news before bed, because then I don't sleep. But my friends made a really good suggestion, which is pick one thing. One thing. You don't have to do it all. Pick one thing that you can do. One group to ally yourself with. And there are so many out there now that are doing good work. And that's it. That's all you have to do. But doing something helps alleviate that sense of powerlessness that I think many of us are suffering from. So, we try to look at the good things that are going on, the pushback, the responses that we see in our communities and across the country. And I think it's important for our own peace of mind and mental health, rather than tuning it out, to, we can have some boundaries for ourselves, but to get enough involved to work on one issue. And I think that helps a lot.
Yeah, and I also think, if I could add, that we're fortunate, at least in social work and in law, that we are very well positioned to do the work. I mean, it's kind of like our wheelhouse if we choose to accept it. Um,
I agree.
so, Sunny, thank you so much for being willing to do this in a timely way. I know we kind of rushed you. We brought you out of a wonderful retirement to talk about this. We're really grateful. Thank you. It was an absolute pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again to Sunny Harris Rome for joining us and agreeing on really short notice to be my final guest in my role as host of the podcast. So, this is it for me after 18 years with the UB School of Social Work podcast. It's been a gas. I want to thank Deans Nancy Smith and Keith Alford for supporting the show and never, not once, telling us what kind of podcast to do or what not to do a podcast on. That's really amazing. Thanks to all of the folks I've worked with over the years, the former hosts, IT staff, and faculty. I've worked alongside graduate assistants who have been instrumental in the production and delivery of this show. These are not so-called errand runners, but true collaborators in making the podcast what it is. Thanks to Trevor Jones, Josh Bradley, Katie Clark, Rebecca Ruin, Yishin Vivian Wu, Michelle Bricker, Caitlin Beck, now Caitlin Rudin, Zeev Nawam, Michelle Melton, Kate Bears, Nick DeSmet, and Ryan Trove. Say hi, Ryan.
Hello.
A special thanks to my colleague and friend Steve Sturman. We've been together from the start, and he's the glue who holds the whole thing together. Sincere thanks, Steve. We've done a lot of podcasts, and we've shared a lot of laughs. The guests make the show. Thanks to every last person who freely gave their time and expertise. The best part of the job was meeting you, learning from you, and for some, staying in touch long after the interview. And of course, the listeners. Without listeners, there's no podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to tune in for continued podcasts in our series with our new hosts, Drs. Joanne Lee and Todd Sage. I know it's going to be good. Finally, and so it falls unto my lot that I must rise and you should not. So I'll gently rise and softly call, good night and joy be with you all. Bye, everybody.